how do you operate? And he said, it's easy. If any trouble arises for the industry, I just call our senator. Who's your senator? Joe Manchin, of course. Joe Manchin was the senator from West Virginia. He owned 2 coal companies personally. That was the family wealth. And he was basically there in his position to block any climate change action for 30 years. So that was one thing that broke American politics. It just stopped being representative of basic issues. And till this day, if you observe the Trump administration, there's not a single moment of discussion about poor people, about their needs, about the role of government. In fact, the whole attempt in the next few months will be to destroy any public services for the poor, especially health care. It's amazing. But this is Elon Musk running the show. He doesn't have to worry about his health care costs. So this is one point. The second point that destroyed American politics was the security state. We became a national security state back in 1945, essentially, after World War II, and especially in 1947 with the National Security Act, which established the CIA and the Defense Department and the other institutions of the security state. America has, as everybody knows very well, military bases in 80 countries around the world. Can you imagine, never in history, with even the British Empire, of course, it was a different era, didn't quite have this. And so this is American government is a military machine all over the world, plus a secret army, the CIA, whose job it is to overthrow governments that are deemed to be inimical to U.S. interests. And the CIA has engaged in probably about 100 regime change operations around the world since 1947. I've seen some of them with my own eyes. Literally, the CIA carrying off heads of government. One was Aristide, who I advised, from Haiti, and they took him away in an unmarked plane and flew him to Central African Republic in broad daylight. And by the way, when they overthrew him, the New York Times wouldn't even run a story about it because this is how the security state operates. It wasn't deemed to be newsworthy that the United States, or it wasn't deemed to be fit to print, let me say, that the United States had overthrown a government in our hemisphere. Of course, it had done that repeatedly, but when I called the reporter, she told me that the editor was not interested in the story. Okay, my point is that the government, you can't run a democracy and a security state the same way. Eisenhower told us that on January 17th, 1961, when he said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." Believe me, since then, it has only grown to gargantuan proportions. If you look at this leak 3 days ago of the attack on the Houthis, okay, there are several notable things about it. First, they behaved like 14-year-olds, up to and including the emojis. Okay, these are children. Second, as they noted, this has nothing to do with the Houthis. This is to send a message. Third, they applauded when they destroyed a building that supposedly included some target, but it killed 50 civilians. And it was all muscles and American flags. Fourth, this was decided in a completely haphazard way by the White House. Congress had no role. There was no discussion of it. Fifth, the only thing that the politicians find odd about this whole episode, not the bombing of a country in which we are not at war, not the killing of civilians, not the fact that this was I can't use the right words because they're not proper for polite company, but not the way to do this. They can't figure out that something's wrong. All they care about is that it breached secrecy. You know what? That's the least interesting part of this. The fact that you have secrecy that enables random killings of this sort on a routine basis is what's wrong. We should be applauding the break of the secrecy, but the only thing the Congress and the press itself talk about is the secrecy element. They don't talk about how wrong it is to be bombing people. They don't talk about the fact that the reason for the war in Yemen is that there's no solution to the Palestine issue. No substance, just a war machine. So these, to my mind, are the two fundamental failures of the United States. We don't have a functioning political system. It doesn't address real needs. It enables one person to decide we're not part of the Paris Climate Agreement. It enables one person to break apart the international trading system. This is extraordinary. If you think about it, tariffs, by the way, under the US Constitution, are the responsibility of Congress, because tax authority, going back hundreds of years in British constitutional rule, are in the domain of the Parliament or the House of Commons. That's where Parliament came from, which was to limit the tax authority hundreds of years ago. No congressman is objecting to Trump unilaterally setting tariffs. How is he doing that, by the way? It's completely unconstitutional in substance. He's doing it because we have emergency legislation that allows the President of the United States to declare a national emergency. So the tariffs on China are under a fentanyl emergency. Can you imagine how artificial that is, how bogus that is, how it has nothing to do with the issues at hand, but also how not a single member of Congress stands up and says, you're taking our authority. If we had a functioning Congress, a congressman would stand up and say, this is our responsibility. You cannot appropriate the voice of the people. This is what revolutions are supposed to be about, that the King of England could not set taxes on the colonies. That's how we started. Now we have a mad king who sets taxes day by day, and Congress has no interest in even intervening in that subject. So this is the essential problem. The country works fine on areas where you don't need a government, but it fails on every area where you do. Our infrastructure fails, the inequalities, the environment, the environmental protection, all of it is failing badly because we don't have a functioning government in the United States.
Jeff?
More reasons why they don't like me in Washington.
Jeff, you have been a friend for many years. Sonia is not the biggest lady I've seen. And is your life ever at risk? I'm just asking on behalf of others.
Maybe from Sonia.
Then you're in good shape.
But I don't think so. I think the capacity of the U.S. government to utterly ignore me is inexhaustible. And that is actually, in my view, really the truth. If I were a student on a student visa, I would be dragged out of our house, no doubt, because that's what's happening to our students right now. day by day. I don't know what will happen in the U.S. in general. It could get worse. It really could get worse. I've used, since I've been in China for the last week, I have used semi-jocularly, but not entirely, the Cultural Revolution meme. We are in a bit of a cultural revolution in the United States. It's played as culture wars, but basically we have a leader who wants to destroy parts of government. This is clear. This is Elon is doing that work. What the real purpose is not completely clear. Maybe I'll just mention actually one very important point to understand. I think everybody knows it, but let me emphasize it. One of the core points of failure of politics in the United States is the budget. Because if you are governed by lobbying and by campaign contributions, you cannot have an effective fiscal policy. On the one hand, you have a population which votes, and so you need somehow to not have complete turmoil. And so you can't really cut, so far, Social Security, for example. You have not been able to cut Medicare or Medicaid. You can't stop paying interest on the debt. And they don't want to stop the military, which is about 3.5% to 4% of GDP if you include everything. If you take those items, the pensions, and including the various kinds of pensions, including veterans benefits, and the health care, and the interest on the debt, and the military, you have roughly 20% of GDP in spending. Our taxes are around 16% of GDP at the federal level. So you start out, even before you have any domestic programs at all, with a deficit of about 4% of GDP. Now, in our lobby-run politics, the first rule is don't raise taxes. So the taxes, especially on wealthy people. So the highest goal in fiscal policy of the Trump administration is to extend the low taxes that were voted 10 years ago on corporate taxes, which have basically been gutted. We don't collect corporate tax except in a very small amount.